Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for coming by my shop. I'm doing a series of videos that I'm hoping might help some of you out there who are considering adding a hand plane to your shop, but aren't sure if dropping the big money is the right way to go. In the first video I went over the things you need for a properly functioning hand plane and why you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of money to get it. In this video, I'm going to show you what the high water mark of hand planes is with this Stanley Bailey number 5. And we're going to compare and contrast it to several of these off-brand or second quality planes, where these 5 here are useful everyday users in my shop. In the third video of this series, I'll go over a few more hand planes. So now let's briefly talk about what a good hand plane is. And the idea of this discussion is if you find a hand plane out in the wild and you see the price on it, you might want to try to determine if it's a good price or a bad price and a plane worth going for or moving on from. So I have 3 Stanley Baileys. This is a number 3 type 12 in the Sweetheart era. This is a number 5. I think it's a type 15, again toward the end of the Sweetheart era. And finally a number 4 up here. It's either a type 16 or a type 17. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to be focusing mostly on this guy because he's the biggest and easiest to see the features on him. So if you find a plane in the wild, it might be rusty and dirty. Obviously you want to see if it's got any breaks or chips or any serious defects in it. A lot of times the horn is broken, sometimes the knob has chunks taken out of it, sometimes the corners or the cheeks might be broken. A lot of times around the mouth there might be cracks. You also want to examine it for obviously any markings that will give you an idea to the brand. Stanley typically puts several marks on their planes, particularly into the 20th century and beyond. If there are no markings or trademarks to give you clues, you want to look at the body a little more closely. With the older planes, particularly the higher quality, they were typically japanned. So it's a black finish, and japanning goes on very thick, and it's hard to tell. You don't know what you're looking for, but a lot of times it will fill in the lettering, if there's lettering, because it goes on so thick. And if there's any chips in it, that may also give you an idea if it's a thick finish or perhaps a painted on one. From what I understand, enamel paints were around from the 20th century, but the better quality tools stuck with the japanning up through World War II. Next on the inspection, you want to look at the hardware, whether they're brass or steel, and that would be the nuts that are holding on the knob and the tote, and the depth adjustment nut. On the Stanley Baileys, those are made of brass, except through the World War II years and sometime later than that. Then you want to look at the wood pieces. A couple things to notice. If you can tell if they're made of an exotic wood, again it might take a bit of a trained eye. Rosewood, of course, was the best wood out there, but not all the quality planes used rosewood, and after World War II rosewood was very hard to come by. And on the tote in particular, the Stanley planes, there's not a flat surface to be had. The flats of the side have a very slight curve to them, and they very gracefully and gently wrap around to the other edges. Next, the good quality planes are heavy for what they are. They're typically made of cast iron, although some of them are made of forged steel, and the frogs are made of cast iron. So they should be cast. You probably want to avoid any plane that has a stamped steel frog. At this point you want to take a look. Does it have a big wheel down here, or is it smaller for the depth adjustment? You want to see if there's a frog adjustment mechanism. And the Y adjustment lever in here for the Stanleys are cast, and some of them are laminated steel. Here's a close-up view of 2 other planes showing it. Here you can see this is a cast iron Y adjustment yoke. That's just a solid piece of metal. Where this guy over here, if you look at it closely, you can see it's 2 pieces of steel that are laminated together. And beyond that, you have to take it apart to get a closer look. So if you're able to, get the lever cap off. The Stanley Baileys have a spring tab back here. And for the iron and chip breaker, in my experience, they all pretty much look like this. So there may or may not be clues to be had. Obviously, if the iron has a trademark on it, perhaps there may be markings down on the chip breaker. And then finally, we get a closer look at the frog. And about the only thing you may make a note of is that the later Stanley Baileys had a keying mechanism. They registered the front of the frog on a slot and a boss to help locate it a little bit better. And then we get to the lateral adjust lever. So the first thing to notice is that the thumb tab on the Stanleys, this is a separate piece of steel that's swaged into the lever. Then down here where it engages the slot in the iron for the lateral movement, the Stanley Baileys have a wheel down here that rotates on a pin. And then of course there's a pin that it pivots on. So depending on where you're going to count the pieces, you got the lever and the tab, there's 2 pieces, and then the wheel and the pin that it rotates on. So it's a 4-piece lateral adjust lever, and often Stanley stamped their name or other information on this lateral adjust lever. So in my opinion, this is a ridiculously expensive piece. And just quickly, I want to compare it to a Vaughan and Bushnell, which is also a decent enough plane. This lateral adjust lever is just a stamped piece of steel. This may have been cut and shaped in a single action. No wheel down here, it's just a bent tab, no separate tab swaged in. Again, just a couple ears that have been bent over for the thumb mechanism. I've never seen another plane that has this type of lateral adjust. I'm told the Bedrocks do. I don't own one to confirm that, but I believe it's true. I've also heard rumors that the Record or Record brand hand planes that come out of England, some of those had a lever very much like this. And I've also heard that there's a brand out of Australia called Turner that has a lateral adjust similar to this one. So here's a quick rundown of all the features we kind of touched on with the Stanley Baileys of the Type 15 era. And I just want to be really clear. If you're looking at a hand plane that maybe doesn't have some of these, in fact, even a hand plane that doesn't have any of these features, it could still turn out to be a very nice hand plane. So you might find a plane like this out in the wild. It's obviously the size and shape of a number 5. I did not buy this, and I wouldn't recommend it. It didn't have an iron and chip breaker in it. But let's go over the things. First of all, it's got a black finish on it. It's hard to tell. It does say made in USA. It looks pretty crisp, the lettering, so I'm hesitant to think that this might be Japanning. And as I look at the chips down here, the finish seems pretty thin to me, so I would bet more that this is probably a paint. It does have brass, the nuts that hold the knob and the toad on. Curiously, even though it's a number 5, there is no screw up front here on the toe to hold the toad in place that there would be on a Stanley Bailey. And clearly the knob and the toad are not made of rosewood. They're hardwood, presumably that have been stained or lacquered a deep red color. And as I look at the tote, you can see there's a clear flat area here where there's a transition from the flat to the curve. It looks more like this was a flat piece that simply had the edges rounded over on something like a router. So that is not a tote that somebody put a lot of time and effort into. The depth adjustment wheel is small and it's too dirty to tell if it's steel or brass. You may or may not have a magnet with you, but that is magnetic, so this one happens to be steel. The Y-yoke adjuster is cast. Finally, on this particular plane, the lever cap has a 409 on, and it doesn't really look like it belongs on this plane. It seems a little undersized, but that's my opinion. It's also been painted black. Tempted to think that this was painted black by a previous owner. I happened to put this chip breaker and iron on it. This was one that I owned, so this plane was not complete, which is the biggest reason why I would say don't bother buying it. The lateral adjust is nothing to write home about. The Frog does not have a registration in here. I'm willing to bet if you loosen these screws, there's going to be a lot of play in here. And finally, in summary, I believe that this is a Defiance hand plane. And I say it's a Defiance because I own a Defiance and I recognize it. And I did purchase this plane for not a lot of money many years ago, and it's turned into certainly a competent user in my workshop. So if this plane were complete and in good enough shape, for the right price, I think it may be worth purchasing. This is one of the planes that are almost universally on the list of planes to not buy. And the dead giveaway is the stamped steel Frog. I think there are 2 brands that look like this. Pexto is one of them. I forget what the other one is. But if I can catch the light correctly, you can see that over here there's a big flat area on the tote. And where they transitioned into the horn, it isn't even uniform. So I don't even think they bothered to put this on a router. It almost looks like somebody shaped it with a file and some sandpaper. This depth adjustment wheel is tiny and the yoke is laminated. Nothing about this plane tells you that it's high quality. And no discussion of crappy planes would be complete without the discussion of the Harbor Freight plane. I purchased this for about the price of a Big Mac, got 10-15 years ago, and it does work okay. If you can get the iron sharp, it will do what you ask it to do. The steel on this does not hold an edge very well. So if this is your plane, it wouldn't be a bad plane to learn about using planes, sort of cut your teeth on it. But I think after a while, if you're anything like me, you're going to want to get a better version of a hand plane. And again, to round it out, you can see there's a big flat on the tote, and it doesn't even have the traditional lever cap and in-depth adjustment and all that. And this iron is pretty tiny. So here's a plane I picked up several years ago for the price of a Big Mac or two. I have a series of videos doing the restoration on this guy. My opinion, a plane well worth the money. As you go down through the progression as I discussed it, it does have the Foursquare logo on it. So if you're familiar with it, this was one of Stanley's secondary brands. The trademark on the iron also says Foursquare. The nuts holding the knob and tote on are made of brass. It does not have frog adjustment screw. Frog is cast iron, the Y yoke is cast, and the wheel on it is steel, and it's smaller. It does have a spring tab on the lever cap. If you look closely at the lateral adjust lever, you can see it's bent up here for the thumb tab, but yet curiously it has the wheel down low, sort of a hybrid of the Stanley Bailey that we were talking about earlier. The furniture on this guy is perhaps the most beautiful rosewood I have in my shop, and it's an interesting story. When I first got this plane, I think there was a shellac coating on the knob and tote, and it had bleached and faded, and it kind of made this look like ordinary hardwood. And where it was a secondary quality plane, I assumed it was hardwood. It wasn't until I started to strip it and refinish it that I discovered it was beautiful rosewood. It's full height with a healthy horn. There's not a flat surface to be seen on it. And the tote also has a screw that's accepted on the front toe. The frog has a slot in it to key against the rib that's on the frog seat. The screws that hold the frog down certainly look as big and beefy as they need to be. And this plane, with the except for the fact it's not japanned, seems to have all the features that you would look for in a quality hand plane. So here's my roll-up for the Foursquare. Besides the lack of japanning and the lack of the frog adjustment mechanism, it pretty much has everything that a Stanley Bailey has. And in my workshop, this is one of my favorite hand planes. So here are my everyday users in my shop, and only this one is a Stanley Bailey. All these other ones are other brands, and I picked them all up for relatively short money. And I'm not saying you're going to go out to Craigslist and find a real bargain on a plane, but my advice to you is if you think hand planes might be right for you, is to keep your eyes open, know what you're looking for, and value the price you're paying for it based on the information I've given you here. And the whole point of this video is to not have you shy away from what could be a very good value. So that's all I got. Appreciate you sticking with me, and I hope some of this information proved to be useful. If you haven't already, check out the first video in this series where I go over what I think is necessary for a good functioning hand plane and why you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of money to get it. Then in the third video in this series, I'm going to go over more of the hand planes from my workshop that are secondary and tertiary brands, and how all the ones that I bothered to tune up are working just great. Don't want to miss that. All the planes that I featured here, I have videos on my channel, and feel free to check those out as well if you want to see more details on how I fixed them up. And like I always say, stay safe, take care, and keep your eyes out for the next one.